Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Welcome to the Cove Podcast. I'm your host, John Hardgrave, and in today's conversation, we're exploring unique people and unique roles. As such, we're joined today by Devon Matsalla, a retired colonel of the Canadian Army with over 26 years service. He's deployed to Afghanistan twice, serving as the operations officer and technical liaison officer in Kandahar, and has commanded 5th Service Battalion in Quebec. He's a former artillery officer who has later moved into the Royal Canadian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. Devon has written extensively on logistics, sustainment and operational planning. These days, Devon saw the light, came to the Australian Army, and he works at the 1st Div as a lead exercise planner, a role he's held for about the last 4 years. So what started as planning a small joint force entry operation has grown into designing and running multinational seminars on warfighting in the Indo-Pacific. He brings together Corps, Div and Brigade commanders from across the region, planning, preparing and acting as a master of ceremonies for discussions on challenges of coalition operations. Devon's career blends a really unique operational leadership perspective, technical expertise and international collaboration. So we're really pleased to have Lieutenant Colonel Matsalla on the Cove Podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you very much, John. Really pleased to be here.
It's not every day that we meet and have the opportunity to talk to a Canadian who's now in the Australian Army. I guess for the readers, they've heard a little bit about your history there, but let's start back at the start. You joined the Canadian Army.
Okay.
So let's explore what that is, because people really enjoy hearing about the other, I'm going to say coalition forces that we have. Can you tell us about your early career in the Canadian Army and what drew you into the military?
Sure. So I joined the military after having joined the cadets, and so that kind of paved my path. Also, the opportunity to go away to the military college and get a free education was a big bonus there, right? So I signed on the line. I had done some reserve time as well with the Calgary Highlanders, sort of Tuesday nights and weekends. So I had a feel for what the environment was like. I liked it. And it made a lot of sense to pursue a career in it. And so when I went away to military college, I actually chose Royal Canadian Electrical Mechanical Engineers as my first choice. But for whatever reason it was, they actually gave me artillery. I was happy with artillery. And so for the first 10 years of my career, I did go through relatively typical artillery officers' progressions. So I started off as the gun position officer and the FUFAC and troop commander, and deployed to Bosnia a couple of times. And
yeah, right. A couple of times.
Yeah, a couple of times to Bosnia there. And that was a great experience before I had the opportunity to change back to what I had originally chosen, which was in the Ramie Corps.
So what you studied at the college probably more aligned to Ramie, I'm guessing, than
mechanical
artillery.
Engineering.
So you studied mechanical engineering and they put you in artillery.
It made a lot of sense. I mean, artillery is quite a technical trade, and there are a lot of folks in the artillery that do a lot of technical work. As you can imagine, just the ballistics calculations that are everything's required. You have to have a technical background for that. And fortunately, when I moved into the Ramie, I had an opportunity to continue serving the artillery, because one of the first jobs that I had was to be the project manager for the M777 acquisition project. So there
From across the border?
Well, it was a foreign military sales,
Yep.
so we did get the equipment from the United States, but it was very much a Canadianization of the M777 suite that we brought in directly into operations in Afghanistan there. So I was able to bring my engineering expertise to an artillery problem and bring some pretty amazing capability to the Canadians in theatre.
So you mentioned that you started off with some reserve work as well in the Canadian Highlanders.
Yep.
Now that's a pretty cool name. Is that an infantry battalion or is it the reserve construct the same over there as what you see here?
It is similar. In Canada, much like Australia, they do recognize some of their traditions are, back to the UK. And there are a number of reserve regiments that have Scottish lineage. So, for example, there's the Seaforth Highlanders, the Calgary Highlanders. There are a number of units that actually wear the kilts and the Glengarries and play the bagpipes. I actually joined as a musician. because when I was in the Army cadets, I played the bagpipes. And so when I got to 17 years old, it made sense to move in and actually, get some money by playing shows with the reserves. And I had a great time as a musician for about a year before I entered into the regular force.
That's a jack of all trades, from musician to artillery officer to Raimi.
It was fantastic.
That's a journey in itself.
Yeah, it was good fun.
I think from memory as well, you've just sort of given me a thought bubble. I believe there were some Canadian troops at Gallipoli as well.
That's correct.
You probably know this better than me, but they were up from Newfoundland or something like that, up that way.
The Royal Newfoundland Regiment.
There we go. My memory's not too bad.
Yeah,
there we go.
Was well done. Well done.
Yeah.
You would probably know more about the campaign than I would, because it's part of the Australian culture. Yeah. It's one of those. It's a footnote in the Canadian side, because of course most of the Canadian campaign was fought on the European side. In Western Europe, but certainly Gallipoli comes up, and the Royal Newfoundland Regiment likes to remind us of that.
The only reason it jogged my memory is I've got some friends who are living in Canada, and he's a mate of mine who was ex-defence, met a girl, moved to Canada. That whole story. His wife's family were from Newfoundland. They call them Newfies, and I believe they're the I don't know what the equivalent is, Victorians maybe. Is that how we look at it?
Maybe.
Tasmanians, that's the one.
Yeah, maybe Tasmania is compared to Newfies are. They've got a bit of an accent. They speak differently when they talk. They actually have an accent that's different. They have very strong links to their heritage in the UK. So a lot of Irish, sort of Celtic kind of background there. But they tend to be pretty good joke tellers. Yeah, when you get a Newfie out, when you go out for beers and stuff like that, you're guaranteed to have a knee-slapping good time.
There you go, with the Newfies.
Yeah.
You raised a good point there, because Canada has a number of languages, particularly French, I think, right, and English. Within the Canadian Army, are both spoken, or is there a trend to both, or is it just English only?
So in the military, like in all of Canadian government, bilingualism is mandatory, actually. Wow. Now, depending on where you are in Canada, there are areas of Canada that are more unilingual. I actually grew up in Calgary. Calgary is quite English. There are small pockets of French, but multiculturalism, there's a lot of pockets of other languages as well. But there is, in all government circles, bilingualism is actually a requirement. And in order to progress past the rank of captain, you actually have to achieve a minimum bilingualism requirement in order to get there. So whether you started in English or you started in French, you actually have to get bilingual in order to progress up the ranks.
So have you kept your French?
I have. Fortunately, my wife is francophone. She's Quebecoise, and she helps me to practice. Particularly when she's annoyed at me, then the French comes out.
That's a really fascinating insight, because I don't think it's something as an Australian army we even consider a bilingual, if it's a language, it's a specialty. It's not a requirement.
It's a double-edged sword. Having a second language is a fantastic capability, right? For Canada to be able to interact with other armies around the world, like the French army, or many of the armies in the militaries in North Africa, throughout the Caribbean as well. Yep. For example, when I deployed to Haiti, everybody in Haiti speaks French, and the fact that we could speak French made it very easy for us to integrate with the local population and things like that. So speaking that second language is a real game changer. This being said, it's also a requirement, and I can remember a few folks that were absolutely fantastic leaders, but they struggled with their second language. And as a result of that, they were kept back until such time as they could get that second language up. So it's funny to see, but sometimes you've got some of these fairly senior folks that are spending a lot of time brushing up on their French, taking lessons on the side, because they have to get that French up to a certain level in order to get promoted and continue their career.
It's a fascinating catch-22, isn't it?
It is.
But you're glad you learnt the French, though, obviously, so you can...
Yeah, I learned it probably I would say the fun way. Right. When I went to military college, I met my first French girlfriend. She brought me back to her hometown in Saint-Georges-de-Beauce, and I had to spend my weekends completely immersed in the French culture, so I picked it up very quickly.
You got it the easy way. Yep.
Yeah, I'd highly recommend, if you want to start learning a second language, start dating people in that language. You will definitely pick it up very quickly.
That's a hot tip for young players.
There you go.
But with the Canadian Army, you've talked about the many deployments you've done, including Bosnia and off to Haiti. We often talk about how militaries are perceived Australians are generally perceived really well across the world. From what I've seen, Canadians, there's a similar kind of approach. They're seen as a friendly kind of people. As the Canadian Army, are they well received within the coalition environments? Is it we're a small nation. There's probably a lot of comparable pieces around Australia and Canada other than the snow. But are you received well? Is it generally a warm welcome for Canadians?
We'll probably get into a lot of the differences between Canada and Australia, but there are far more similarities. Yep. We're very much cut from the same cloth. And in many ways, I would say that the Canadian military is more like, or the Canadian culture in general, is more like Australia than even with the United States right across the border, right? Because of the Commonwealth lineage that we have. Our structures are very similar. The form of government that we have, a lot of the military terms and histories and culture that we have is also very similar. So when I move around the ADF, I find that sometimes the terms are a little bit different. Sometimes some of the history is, a little bit more Pacific than it is in the Atlantic. But I'm not out of place. I can always navigate my way to where things would logically fit within the Canadian military. And so it's, when you talk about how we're perceived internationally, I would say it's much the same thing. Canada was, of course, involved in peacekeeping. Our Prime Minister, Lester B. Pearson, was instrumental in setting up the first peacekeeping missions in the Middle East in the 1950s. And since then, Canada has been involved in every single peacekeeping mission ever since. So Canada is perhaps a little bit more associated with peacekeeping type missions.
Yep.
But Australian has been in many of those operational theaters as well. And because of the size of our military and I would say, our flexibility to adapt to complex situations, many people see us as problem solvers when we're deployed overseas.
When we often think of Canada, we think snow, ice, cold. Is it a cold weather military, or is that just a perception that people have because they think Canada, they think snowboarding and skiing, therefore everything's done in the snow and the cold? Or is it a real mix of genuine, dry warfighting, or is it heavily, I guess, focused to that cold space?
So the first caveat I'll say is that while Canada is a Nordic country, most of the population lives within a couple 100 kilometers of the American border. So we're all huddled up in the south there, where it's as warm as possible as it could be in Canada. But this being said, when I was talking to my mother yesterday, it's minus 20, and everybody's shoveling their driveways and they're slipping on the ice. It is a cold climate, and the military embraces that. Now, of course, part of, when you look at Canada strategically, we also have a significant amount of the north. There are natural resources in the north that have to be protected.
A high level area. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are potential avenues of approach that also need to protect it. And that's why, Canada developed with the United States the DEW line, which is an early warning line back in the 1960s because of the Soviet threat back in the day. There's a similar kind of initiative that's being done now in order to protect against those corridors. And much of the bluster that you hear about Greenland is for the same reasons, right? Because there are those strategic corridors that could potentially lead, to conflict. And so Canada has an obligation to maintain a presence in the north. We do that a few ways. One is the military does a lot of winter exercises. Every single winter, I had to put on my parka and get out there at minus 40 and freeze my butt off while I'm, preparing my rations in the snow and building my little snow fort and sleeping in there and just being able to survive in that environment. But the same thing for all of the services, right? So as much the Air Force and the Navy, they have to be able to survive in those Arctic conditions. The Navy breaks out their icebreakers and they actually perform operations over there. But at the same time, we actually have part of the Canadian military that's called the Canadian Rangers. If you Google it, you'll see a whole bunch of folks that are dressed in red hoodies.
Okay.
Right? Jumpers. And they vary. So these are genuinely Inuit people. So people of the North, Aboriginal people of the North, that are fiercely proud to be able to don the Ranger red hoodie and drive around in their ski-doos, assuring a presence in the North. They maintain communications with our strategic headquarters, and so if there is anything that's seen, if there's, but also for search and rescue operations, there's a fair amount of traffic that's starting to go through the Northwest Passage up in the Canadian Arctic because those waters are thawing. Traffic can actually get through there, and so the Rangers provide a lot of that coverage in the north. and are a key component of the Canadian Army, as a matter of fact.
It sounds very similar to the same concept as with our North Force battalions and Far North Queensland regiments and Pilbara regiments.
Yeah.
Using the Indigenous who know the land like the back of their hand to provide that early warning. So it's not too dissimilar. Yeah. Just the heat or the cold.
It's a very different environment for sure.
I mean, operating in the cold like that, I couldn't think of anything worse. Did you ever have an opportunity when you're in the Canadian military to do an exchange with Australia or exercise, in Australia at all?
My only exchange with Australia, or my interaction with Australia, was during my deployments.
Sure.
So when I was in Afghanistan, there was an Australian contingent right on the other side of the Kandahar airfield. Made a couple of friends over there, and used to go for runs with the Aussies and stuff like that. We get along well, right? The Canadians and the Aussies, and so that was good fun there. But deployed up to Shawalikat on a couple of operations with the Australians there. Trying to think, in Bosnia as well, there was an Australian contingent.
There was a few contingents, yeah.
I didn't have a lot of interaction with them, but that's when I would have seen them. But I never actually did any exercises per se with the Australians.
Because I was just thinking that exchange piece, if I was to go over to minus 40, I'd be a casualty in a couple of hours, I think, and the heat would be similar, I was imagining, for a Canadian coming to Australia and having to exercise.
Yes, Canadians melt when it gets a little bit too hot, for sure. I mean, it's all about your equipment, right? And the Canadian military equips itself well for the winter environment, right? And so, if you can imagine the amount of equipment that you have to sign out in the clothing stores here in Australia, well, multiply that by 3 because everything's got to be, significantly thicker for that cold weather. But also the vehicles as well. Like diesel doesn't start when it gets below minus 15.
Right.
And so what you need to have is like glow plugs in the engine in order to be able to heat up the area. And so all military equipment needs to be able to survive at minus 40 weather. And so that's an important consideration when it comes to procurement as well.
It's just a fascinating piece to look at the differences, the similarities, but so different, which is a good segue, I guess, into talking about some of the differences between the Canadian military in your experience and then the Australian military. We were talking off air before. I remember being in the battalion and they made the announcement, and it came to Australia pretty quickly, that Canada decided to legalise marijuana. Yeah. And then as such, the Defence had legalised marijuana and put a policy in similar to the, I guess, alcohol policy, which sent some, made some interesting discussions around the cages at the battalion. You were roughly around that time as well. I guess that's one of the big differences, I suppose, but as an example, but maybe talk us through what that looked like, because I think that would have been an interesting conversation to have in the units. Yeah,
it was fascinating, and we knew it was coming, right? Because the Canadian government had made the announcement. We knew that legalization would be coming in the coming years. And so the discussions were starting very early on. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of angst, right? A lot of sergeant majors out there saying, I don't want this stuff in my unit. I don't want people smoking pot and all the rest of the stuff. As we got closer to legalization, as the scientific studies came out, talking about the effects of marijuana on the body, on your ability to perform, on your ability to recover after having smoked marijuana, and that'd be an interesting study to participate in. Yeah,
you're right. Who puts their hand up for that? Yeah,
I'm just sure lots of people had their hand up for that one there. But they performed a lot of these studies, and they came out with ways that they could test it, the ways that they could control it. And of course, legalization means that they can legalize also the quality that is sold, and so you don't get stuff that's laced with all sorts of crap out there in the street. So you've got only the good THC or whatever you're looking for in the pot. But within the military circles, we had to come to the realization that pot was essentially being considered as another intoxicant, just like alcohol, just like nicotine or whatever it might be. And so we came to the conclusion that in the same way that we have to control alcohol consumption and any other, substance that you would consume that has debilitating effects, pot is in the same category. So the policies that came out were, you can't have any marijuana in your system when you're going to work. In the same way that you can't have any alcohol in your system when you go to work. Yes, you are absolutely allowed to partake in marijuana or in alcohol or any other legal substance in your spare time, but you just need to make sure that you're making that separation between your spare time and your operational effectiveness. And when you put it that way, it made a lot more sense, and it took the took the stigma away from pot as, the bad drug that many people think of it.
Yep.
And it's just another intoxicant that needs to be controlled and, used in moderation.
Yep. It's a good segue again into some of the differences, I think, in your experiences. And we used to use that one as an example because it's very topical. Well, it was very topical. As you've come across the Australian Army, you would have experienced a different culture with the Australian Army. Perhaps talk us through some of the things that may have surprised you the most as you started to serve in the Australian Army.
Sure.
And then we'll talk about how you got here.
Interestingly, the first thing that really hit me as different as I was getting into the Australian military was putting on a slouch hat. Something as simple as that. Because it's uniquely Australian. No other military in the world uses something as unique as the slouch hat. There's a lot of history that goes back, hundreds of years of why the Australian military wears the slouch hat. But donning that thing on my head, figuring out how to wear it properly, being a little bit embarrassed about asking for advice, but finally, I actually asked my sergeant major, please help me put my hat on. It hit me as, okay, this is a different organization. Yep. And it was probably the first time that I started seeing some of the cultural differences between Canada and Australia as well. Canada is a country that has, let's say, always had connections much more to Europe, being when it comes to military circles, right? Yep. Because Europe is a lot more accessible. Also connected to the United States, right across the border. There's a lot of connections there. But in the same way, because Canada is so close to the US, we realize just how small our military is. When we go on exercise with the US, we are dwarfed, right? We bring a lot of capability. Yep. But down here in Australia, you've got this corner of the world and you're pretty strong down here, right? You're far enough away from the larger players like the US that you can actually assert some confidence in the region here. I would suggest that perhaps New Zealand feels much the same way as Canada feels, because New Zealand is, say, comparably smaller than Australia is, and maybe feels a little bit like the younger brother.
Good analogy.
Or something like that. So in the Canadian military, there is always this thought that we are not as strong as our neighbors. We need to be more flexible. We need to do more with less a lot of the time, because some of our equipment procurement has had struggles in the past. Particularly in the 1990s, when I was getting in, there was a lot of reductions across the military. The days of having to say bang bang because there was no blanks in the inventory. That was actually, that happened.
Happened in Australian too. Yeah,
of course it did. But I would say that in Canada, it eventually did come back. Once we got back into Afghanistan in 2001, and the public realized the importance in investing in the military. But those years there, it at least formed for my generation in the military an idea that we're always going to have to do more with little resources. So it was about scrounging up the capability that you need in order to get the job done. Yep. Lots of tasks tailored, lots of bringing things together at the last minute. If we have equipment that serves our purposes, great. If we don't, let's figure out another way to do it. So what that's done is it's created in Canada this idea of being flexible, not just to equipment, but to anything, our ability to work with other nations. We're always going to have to partner up. We're always going to be working with somebody that probably has something that we want. And so we have this culture of more flexibility. I think that's formed a lot of the Canadian past. And you look at the Canadian military today, there's a lot more flexibility when it comes to, for example, the way that you present yourself. Your hair can be longer. You can have facial hair, and you can actually even have colored hair in the military now. There's a lot of policies that, 10 years ago, a lot of sergeant majors would have shuddered. But what we've realized is that, the society is changing. Canada is a very diverse, multicultural, open society. And so its military needs to reflect that as well. And so they've embraced a lot of these flexibilities. And providing you can still don your gas mask, if you have green hair, doesn't really make a difference at the end of the day. That's
better camouflage, right?
Yeah, sure.
Maybe not in the snow.
This being said, what I find is in Australia, I think Australia is still a little bit more focused on the operational output.
Yep.
Because Australia in general has, you've certainly had economic difficulties in the past. I think Australia has because of their situation in the world, they have the ability to rely on their equipment a little bit more than Canada perhaps has in the past, to be more independent when they're deploying on operations, because now you don't necessarily have to be part of a coalition in order to be able to deploy somewhere in the near region. And as a result of that, Australia is a little bit more focused on that operational impact, which is why you don't see green hair in the military yet. And I think it's across sort of all things in the Australian military. When I talk to people, the types of language that is used in the Australian military is much more, let's get to the mission, let's get to the operational output. What do we need in order to get to the output? Whereas in Canada, it's a little bit more about the journey, right? Let's make sure that that we're doing things properly, that we're respecting, diversity and bilingualism and all of these things that the Canadian government considers to be very important. Operational is absolutely important, but sometimes in order to get to the objective, you need to take a couple of corners along the way. And I think Canada does that more than in Australia.
Yeah. Is there any other big cultural differences you see or experienced as you come in, or that's like the one that stands out? The Slouch, that's a great example, by the way.
Yeah,
I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, well, I mean the history is a lot different as well, right? Australia was founded in campaigns that were largely fought in this part of the world, right? So you've got the Pacific Campaign of World War II. The
northern borders, Papua New Guinea, right there.
The death marches, and everybody understands, Kokoda Trail, and that's formed, very much the culture of the Australian military. Whereas Canada, it's more about, Dieppe and Normandy, fighting, the landing on the beaches of Normandy and fighting through in 1944. Through the Gap and the Battle of the Bulge and all of that part of Europe, and so. And even back to the founding of the Canadian military, which was in World War I, and that was, that was the first time in World War I that everybody from across Canada all came together and fought at a single point at Vimy Ridge. Yep. And Vimy Ridge is considered to be the place where Canada really came together as a fighting nation. Yep. And so
it's sort of your Gallipoli. I say you are the.
In a way, yes. In the same way that Gallipoli is formative for the Australian military, it was Vimy Ridge for Canada. That's a great example right there. And so because of the difference in the lineage, you find a lot of just the traditions are different, right? The uniforms that we wear, the hat that we wear, the way that you wear your boots, the badges and buttons, but also the traditions within the units, right? The way that we promote, the way that we conduct some of the ceremonies. There's little differences there. They all have the same origin back to ultimately the British. Yeah. But there's a lot of little differences along the way that are a lot of fun.
Looking at, with your huge experience in the Canadian Army, is there things that, and I'll put you on the spot with this one, that they do better that the Australian Army might adopt for the positive change? Like, do you see things you're like, hey, that's something we did really well, that I think would be good to embed, in the Australian defence?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I've got a bunch of things on the other side as well that Canada should listen to from Australia. But in terms of Australia, where Canada has an edge, perhaps, embracing of other cultures. Sure. I think that's a really big one, right down to bilingualism, right? Yep. The fact that everybody has to be bilingual, and as much as sometimes we grumble about it, it is a real game changer in international politics, right? It's billions of people across the world that we can now interact with.
Absolutely.
Because we have that second language. And it's not just the second language, it opens up other doors as well. Because you've got that second language, I think getting to a third is not as big of a jump. And so we got a lot of Canadians, and they're incentivized for having that third language as well. And so the multiculturalism policy in Canada, which is pervasive throughout the society, is also reflected in the military. So what that gives us is in perhaps liaison jobs, in opportunities where we have to interact with other countries and form those relationships with others in the world. I would say Canada just has that edge over Australia. Yep. Whereas Australia, when you look at the military, I mean, there's a lot of diversity within the military.
It's not embraced as much as Canada's.
Yeah. It's not policy.
Gotcha.
Right? In Canada, it's policy. You must be bilingual. You must be multicultural.
Yep.
And so that's probably one area where Canada sort of soars ahead.
So let's flip the coin with your experience.
All right.
What do you think that the Australian Army could offer Canada if you could offer them a few nuggets when the Chief of Canadian Defence Force is watching this?
All right. Hey, sir.
What nuggets of advice could you go, hey, this is something we're doing well that would have helped or would have been good when you were serving in the Canadian Army?
I'll go right back to my day one in the Australian military. I transferred over to Australia because my wife got a job over here, right? So
I think we'll go through that in detail later.
Yeah, but the way that the Australian military leverages other militaries of the world in order to populate its own forces is fantastic. Like when I went through that overseas lateral transfer scheme, I went through with some really great talent, people from all over the world, US, Canada, UK, Korea, South Africa, all wanting to join the Australian military, and the Australian military having the flexibility to be able to pick and choose the very best candidate and getting fully formed operational soldiers for nothing.
Yep.
I kind of call it the Australian foreign military, and I don't want to make any connections to the French foreign military, but the way by which Australia has been able to bring in talent, at least through the scheme that I went through, is very impressive.
So Canada don't have a similar scheme?
It's ad hoc in Canada.
Sure.
I've got a few friends from the UK, and actually even one from Australia that did move to Canada, but it's there's not necessarily an active program.
Sure.
Right? In Australia, you've got a recruiting office right in the UK, right in downtown London, and any soldier from the UK can actually just go right up and recruit a direct entry. But Canada, it's a little bit more. You have to be more proactive, and it's very passive. So that's a really big one. One of the things that Canada struggles with is geography.
Sure.
Geography. It's a big country.
Yep.
But it's not just a big country, is that the population and the military is therefore centered over on the west side. On the east side, right?
Yep.
Most of our big bases are actually right on the coast, right? In Newfoundland.
East Coast.
Yeah.
So not the Calgary side, the other
that's
side.
it.
Right.
Yeah. And you look at where the world is going right now, there's a lot of focus on the Pacific. There is one base on the Pacific coast, but then the nearest hard army base is Edmonton, which is like a 15-hour drive away.
Right.
It's even though there's a lot of focus on the Pacific, the Canada is oriented geographically and politically towards the Atlantic side.
Yep.
So Australia gets it. Australia has positioned forces right there in the north. Of course, has welcomed allies like the US in order to put a foothold there as well, and has conducted operations. And you've got blood on the soil, right? That's where campaigns were fought. And so, because of that position in the world, because of our proximity to potential aggressors, I find that Australia has a much more operational focus. It's tomorrow, right? Tomorrow we could be going to war, and no, we're not necessarily going to have anybody with us. It's right there, and it's right now.
Yep.
So, and Canada, it's more indirect, right? Canada probably needs to deploy forces somewhere in the near future. We'll probably go in a coalition because there's not enough strategic lift anyways to get there. And so it's less operationally focused. So Canada could learn from Australia in its ability to focus its mindset on we're fighting tomorrow.
Yep. I mean, Canada has a huge coastline.
Yeah.
Is there a large littoral sort of focus towards how Canada conducts its work, or is it just a bit of as you said, they haven't operationally, nailed down what it is they're doing, so they're a bit of everything?
Yeah, everybody talks about getting ro-ro ships, and it never really happens.
Yep.
And there was a time, when General Hillier was our chief of defense staff, and he talked about, the Canadian Marines. Maybe we should look a little bit more like the Marine Corps. That never happened. The services were very strong, and so Army, Air, Navy remains very independent, and the littoral is a secondary mandate that's been given to one of the brigades. But the equipment is not quite there. Gotcha. We're not about to conduct littoral operations, with the full spectrum of all capability required to do it independently. It would have to be part of a coalition and leveraging others.
You still obviously have a connection back to Canada. You said you spoke to your mother there. You still follow the Canadian military and the politics there closely? I
do. I've got some of my closest friends are still back in Canada, and
still serving, or are they?
Still serving. Good friends that are actually quite high up in the military.
I was going to say they must be generals by now.
Most of them are 1, 2, a couple of 3-star friends. Yep. I do keep up with those folks. Interestingly, I even get to do that with my current job as well, and we'll get into that. But I keep up with them quite a bit. And one of my, best friends, he's actually out of the military now, Major, formerly Chief Warrant Officer Dave Toft. Dave, if you're listening, he and I keep up a lot about what's going on in the Canadian military, and we share a lot about where it's going and make comparisons about what's happening in Australia too.
It would be hard to remove yourself after 26 years there. You can't just switch that off.
Yeah.
So let's perhaps talk about your journey into the Australian Defence Force and what that looked like. You mentioned earlier you followed your wife to Australia. She obviously found some work here, wanted some more sun or the beach, I'm guessing. And then you said, oh, well, better follow her over here. So did you come to Australia with the express intent of deciding to join the Australian Army, or what did that journey look like?
So it was my wife that announced to me one day that she got a job in Australia. It was very much out of the blue. I know she'd been looking around the world because, we had some flexibility, but she got the job very quickly. She does these public-private partnerships, which are quite valuable. And so KPMG picked her up very quickly and gave me the choice, basically said, for all of the postings that I followed you on to some pretty uncomfortable places, it's your turn. So I went back up to my boss. At the time, it was General Steve Boivin, and I asked him if there was any way that I could work from Australia.
Yep.
In a liaison job and any kind. And actually, General Boivin, he bent over backwards. He did a lot of calls to different international parts of the military, and came back with a suggestion, but it was Canberra. Ugh. Canberra to Brisbane. It just didn't work, so it was time to hang up my hat. And I was very proud with of all of my military service, and I was ready to move into the civilian circles. And it was just while I was interacting with a couple of Australians over here looking for a job, one of them said, "Why don't you get into the Australian Reserves just to give you that recognition of your prior service, a security clearance, and something to continue to give back." I thought it was a brilliant idea. So thanks, Christian Rabi, for that idea there. And so I went through the overseas lateral transfer scheme. And like I said, it was brilliant. Went to Canberra over a 4-day period, did a bunch of tests with some absolutely fantastic people from around the world. And I was selected. And a number of people weren't, actually. That's how good the Australian military has it, is they can actually select who they want.
You've made it sound very easy, but I'm sure it's probably some more hoops than that. How long did this take from application to testing to actually getting an offer, I suppose?
I think usually the process is several months, let's say 3 or 4 months or something like that, maybe a little bit longer. In my case, it was a bit exceptional because I was going from the regular force to the reserves.
Sure.
They had described to me that this had not been done in the past. I made a business case to them and I said, look, I'm coming to Australia whether you like it or not.
Yep.
And I've got a lot of expertise and time to give. I had already identified a job at One Div headquarters where I could potentially give back, and One Div headquarters was super happy to have me. So I said, over to you, right? Make this happen, and I promise you that you won't regret it.
Yeah.
And it took about a year, a little bit over a year, but it did finally come through, and I did my swearing in at One Australian Division headquarters there.
So it's interesting, you weren't in the military, the Australian military, but you managed to find a job within the military. So how did that come about? You leverage a network or some existing partnerships, or is it just the secret colonel's chat on Signal?
So here's the interesting part. You were part of that journey there, John. So as you know, when I was doing my first couple of trips over to Australia, I just started talking to people, right? Friends of friends through LinkedIn, through whatever circles I could get. I went on the journey of 1,000 coffees and started to build my network in Australia. And that led me to you, and you introduced me to a whole bunch of other folks. And it was through those connections that I actually got in touch with the 1st Australia Division, where they actually had a need to. At that time, they were looking to deploy, ways that they would deploy the division more effectively, right? So it was the deployable joint force headquarters back in the day. And so they were looking for somebody to be involved in that. And I was selling it as, when I was in Canada, I'd done a lot of research in theater activation, was involved with a lot of deployments. And so I said, I can really help you in that space. They're like, yeah, sure.
And they haven't regretted it, obviously. You're still doing it. So.
Yeah, certainly have. And connections help, right? It was actually, back to my good buddy, Dave Tofts. He had deployed to the Middle East with General Simon Stewart.
There you go.
Yeah, and so Dave, introduced me to General Stewart there, and said that I was going through the process, and I think General Stewart might have made a couple of calls that might have helped things along the way as well.
It's interesting to tie into Simon Stewart, current Chief Army. Just reflecting on when you were talking about the Canadian Army, how it needs to be flexible and you need to do with what you've got. He was the CO that raised 8-9 RAR. And that was, and when you were talking, I was just having flashbacks to being part of raising the new battalion. And the mantra was do what you can with what you've got wherever you are. Because we didn't have much.
Yeah.
So I was like, I get it. And that mantra is still something that sticks with a lot of people. And I think the Chief Army still says we've got to do what we can with what we've got. You don't have a choice sometimes. Anyway, that was a sidetrack. So you ended up in the 1st Division, lead exercise planner.
Yeah.
Is that your title or is that just what you do? Explain to us your role within 1st Division.
So my role has evolved. My first role when I got into the division is they parked me into the G7 cell. Yeah. They knew that I would be involved in some way in assisting in the planning effort. So it's not necessarily a specific exercise, but planning in the in a deployment capacity. Initially, I had to also reason with the division as well how I would operate in a part-time capacity. As you know, when you're in the reserves, I was a Circat 5, so I had up to 100 days a year that I could work.
But you can burn through quickly, especially if they want you.
Yeah, for sure. But I also had civilian employment. I was working with BHP at the time, and so there was a lot going on at in my civilian time. So I had to balance that time there. I wasn't really into the Tuesday night and weekend model. I was much more interested in being, part of the effort, which meant that I actually had to take some time out of my civilian job in order to go during work hours and interact with people, and that actually worked out okay. My civilian job was supportive of that, but it worked out that the best way that I could contribute to the division was long-term planning of different exercises or activities. So the first one that I did was exercise vital scan, and it was a phase 0 operation, where I brought a bunch of people together in a week-long exercise from across the division, but also from the joint enablers. So we had, folks from Conflot, from the DACE, so air and maritime, as well as from across the division staffs. And we tried to imagine what a contingency plan would look like for a deploying force to get an RBG into one of the near islands. Yep. Right. And so we did a lot of looking at the ground, how do we ingress, what kind of APOD or airports of disembarkation and APODs and SPODs that we could look at in the area, what kind of capability that we had, and then how does that happen, right? So we'd synchronize how all the elements came together. But we also had a note on the diplomatic terms. We knew that we needed to establish the liaison with the heads, the head of the mission, our real rules of engagement. So we had the lawyer that was involved. And so we, public affairs. We tried to look at all aspects of a phase 0 operation until such time as we actually have boots on the ground ready to conduct operations. And it was highly successful. We briefed, it was Major General Scott Winter that was division commander at the time. And when we briefed him, he said, "This is brilliant. And I need to communicate this around to some of his peers." Not just in Australia, but also in the coalition environment. And so as things progressed, I think it was General Winter that realized that we needed to bring our partners together and talk about not just phase 0 operations, but all things coalition operations. And because I'd already started that as leading exercise vital scan, I would take on what was going to be called Pause Years March. Yep. And so it's been 4 years now since my first Pause Years March. Where General Winter gave me the mandate of bringing together as many folks as I could from as many different friendly countries at the division level. So if you can imagine, in the U.S., we've got all of U.S. 1 Corps. So, 25 Infantry Division, 7 Infantry Division, 4, 11 Airborne Division, all of those folks together. So through the network of liaison officers and again, just the same networks that I was using when I was doing LinkedIn in order to find a job, with the similar kind of networks I was using in order to get in touch with these division commanders overseas. And then of course, establishing links with the French, the Canadians. Of course, I insisted on bring in the Canadians, and that one was easy. But eventually we got Japan involved as well, because Japan maintains great links with the headquarters. Tried with Korea, still haven't been able to get Korea. They're always polite, but they haven't showed up for the exercise yet, and a few other countries as well. And it became mounting what would be a week-long exercise to talk about the challenges of coalition warfighting at that division level.
Yeah, with that many divisional commanders in a room, how does any decisions get made? Because I imagine that all have their own opinions. You're the moderator for this. You MC them.
Yep.
I can imagine that could be challenging.
Yeah, it's when it comes to, it's not hard decisions necessarily that are being made, right? There's a lot of good discussions, and there are insights and considerations that are brought up. So while these presentations are being made, while the questions are going on and the discussions are progressing, every once in a while, a general will say, you know what, we've got to get better at this. One of the insights was, we're conducting similar kind of operations within our headquarters. We form multinational headquarters sometimes. Maybe we should share SOPs. Ooh, there's a point right there. Share SOPs. Let's explore this further. So you wind up getting a page full of notes with a bunch of these little tidbits that go into what we call the executive summary.
Yep. Executive
summary is circulated to all of the attendees, and that's where the actions come forward. There's also some clear actions that we take within the division. General Collingburn, who is now the 1 Australian Division Commander, is very keen to use any of those insights that come out of Exercise Posier's March in order to inform his own headquarters planning, how the division is going to be conducting operations in the future. We talk a lot about the 1st Australian Division as the unit of action.
Yep.
Well, building a unit of action at the division level is hard to do. And you have to do it not only at the tactical level, but even at the institutional level, right? We need to build the structures, the equipment, the freedoms in order for the division to be able to operate as that independent organization, to deploy. The capabilities are involved. And all of that requires a lot of thought.
Because I was going to ask, my follow-on question was going to be, what are the biggest challenges? I think you've just talked through it there. Is that the biggest challenge about once you've got it all together and what you've got to do?
Coalition warfighting is so hard. It is so hard. Sometimes it's, I would say that the differences that we have between our countries are one of the biggest challenges, because in order to be able to work together, we need to be able to communicate. We need to be able to, share information. We need to be able to operate together. But we have so many different ways, especially nations that are not English speaking. I mean, that gets into a huge amount of challenge. But even working alongside the Americans, there's a lot of ways that they operate with their divisions that is not the same the way Australia works. And so we need to understand these differences. And the more that we understand each other, the more that we're able to come up with considerations that we can bring to our operations, so that we can reinforce each other more effectively in the future.
So these exercises happen once a year, is it?
Yeah, so I run 2 exercises a year.
2 a year?
Yep. And with my civilian job, that works out just about right.
Okay.
So I do about, let's say, 70 or 80 days per year. And those are stretched, there's little half days all over the place and some full days. And I do 2 week-long exercises. One of them is coming up in April. It'll be from the 8th to the 10th of April, and that's Posier's March.
Yep.
That'll take place in Townsville. And we're bringing 7, possibly 8 different countries together, division commanders from all those countries, as well as brigade commanders from across Australia, all up to Townsville. We'll have a lot of great discussions about coalition warfighting. We're bringing in some great guest speakers from around the world. We're going to talk about the impact of artificial intelligence, automation, all of those pieces. And then there's going to be some static displays as well. Bring a couple of Apaches in, so that we can play around the equipment. I mean, you got to make it fun too, right?
Yeah.
And if we're going up to Townsville, you got to show some of the equipment and, bring people.
Because your Canadian counterparts will love going to Townsville.
Yeah, they will. Actually, I was talking to Brigadier General Wade Rutland. He's commander of 3 Canadian Division, which is going to be coming down during exercise Posier's March. He's up in the Canadian North right now in minus 40 degree weather, and I kind of joked to him and saying it. Last time I don't even think I'd recognize ice anymore unless it's floating in a margarita.
Yeah.
He'll have a bit of a challenge when he's getting up to Townsville there, and it's 35 degrees.
I presume you have a team to support you with this as well, because there's an awful lot of coordination, planning and preparation.
Yeah.
It can't just be on you. You'd have a team within the first div that would support you in getting this all to happen.
Yeah, it's a great interaction. I think we get it right in the 1st Australian Division. It's hard to employ reservists, and you would have had that experience yourself, right? Because you got a bunch of full-time people that are maintaining a certain rhythm as they're planning, as they're progressing, and if the part-timers are not, if they're not close by, they can fall behind, right? They can miss key bits of information. And unless there's a steady flow of information between the full-timers and the part-timers will eventually just air off and they'll go places that they don't need to go. But I've got a great relationship with the G7 currently, Tate Pilditch, that's leading that within the the 1st Australian Division headquarters, as well as the J5, Matt Scott, that's... we have regular discussions, exchange emails, and as I progress things, with the guest speakers and with the invitations and with, developing the schedule and all of these pieces, I'm always keeping them involved.
Yep.
And then at the same time, they keep me involved of what's going on with the division. Like today is actually a great example. They're going to be briefing up the chief of staff on the exercise. And I managed to take a bit of time out of my day to come down here and talk to you, but also to go up to the div and be able to talk to the chief of staff about the exercise and how it's planning. I'll get a bit of direction, and that'll launch me for another couple of weeks so that I can, get some momentum, and then come back, touch point, am I going the right direction, and then keep going.
It's a fascinating concept. It's something I think that the majority of defence wouldn't even know occurs, but it's a huge endeavour.
Yeah.
And it's really important as well.
Yeah.
It just happens in the background for a lot of people in defence who are going about their day-to-day.
It's true. And I like you talked about team, I do have a couple of majors that are reservists that are also working in my cell. That are direct reports there, and like Simon for me as an example is, he's a lawyer in his full time and full time role, and so he's it's a challenge for him sometimes finding the time on the in the evenings and the weekends, but again, because we have a good relationship, I can give him tasks that make sense in the grand scheme of things. So we do manage to get a lot of stuff done, even though some of the people aren't full time. Yeah.
So, Devon, we're coming to the end of the time on the podcast today. I guess I'll give you one last opportunity. You've got a world of experience both in the Canadian Army and now the Australian Army. If you could sort of provide any nuggets of advice or anything that you might say that you think would be helpful to people from your experience, what would that be?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk a bit about transition. When I transitioned out of the Canadian military, it was to transition into civilian life, which is a tough problem for a lot of people, right? And a lot of people struggle with that. On top of that, I also moved to the other side of the planet. It's not exactly the easiest way to transition out of the military because I didn't have a network down here. But what I will say is that, you're so not alone. It was so easy to reach out to people here in Australia and simply just ask for help, right? Reaching, it could have been somebody cold called right out of LinkedIn to say, hey, I'm transitioning out of Canadian military into the civilian workforce in Australia. I notice you've got some background in the ADF. Do you want to go for a coffee? And 9 times out of 10 people, they will bend over backwards, to introduce you to other people, to get you involved in the network. And I tell you, it wasn't too long that I was able to land some really great civilian employment, and that's continued to keep me going. But I will also come back to my continued connection to the military, my ability to serve in the reserves. As you know, I was a full colonel in the Canadian military. I've been busted down to light colonel, but that's okay because I'm at the right level to be able to contribute actively. Without necessarily getting involved in a lot of politics and things like that. And so I'm at the right level to contribute back to Australia, I think. But it also keeps me connected. I get to meet a lot of great people from around the world and across Australia, of course. And that helps me not only with civilian employment, but just, keeping tabs on what's going on in the world. It's invigorating for me, and I don't feel that feeling of loss that a lot of people go through when they get out of the military. So I would encourage others to go through a similar kind of thought process.
Actually, one last question before I let you go. Yeah. What's next? What's next for Lieutenant Colonel Matsalla?
I tell you, I like what I'm doing. I like what I'm doing, and I'd like to continue doing it for as long as logical, I guess. For the time being, I think they're appreciating what I'm doing in the division headquarters. They're still liking the product. Now I'm in the 4th iteration, so that might have an expiry date at one day, and I look forward to something else in the military environment. But I want to keep going as a reservist. I'm going to continue, of course, on the civilian side. I wouldn't see myself getting involved full time in the military service again. And never say never. Yep. Who knows? If there was a deployment or something like that, I might say yes to that. And of course, if I was called to come upon, my sense of duty will always bring me back. But I'll say that as much as possible, I'm going to continue enjoying the absolutely amazing life that we've made for ourselves here in Australia, and sharing that with Australians, so that you can appreciate just how good you have it down here.
Lieutenant Colonel Matsalla, it's been an amazing conversation. I've learned a lot about the Canadian Army. Thank you for your insight. It's been amazing having you on the show.
Oh, thank you, John. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
And until next time, this is The Cove.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.